We just learned, get this, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, has just announced he's resigning. CNN national security reporter Zachary Cohn is joining us right now. Zachary, what more can you tell us about this dramatic development?
Yeah, Wolf, this appears to be a significant resignation at the senior-most levels of the Trump intelligence community. This is Joe Kent. He was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He appearing to post on X a resignation letter that he submitted citing misgivings over the Trump administration's decision to launch its war with Iran. Now, Kent in this letter writes in part, quote, as a veteran who deployed to combat 11 times and as a Gold Star husband who lost my beloved wife Shannon in a war manufactured by Israel, I cannot support sending the next generation off to fight and die in a war that serves no benefit to the American people, nor justifies the cost of American lives. Now, Kent, in his apparent post on X, does also seem to suggest that there was no imminent threat.
Hey everyone, Dr. John here, so welcome home. So what just happened, guys? The Capitol is surrounded, not hypothetically, right now. A sea of protesters pressing against the barricades, signs reading, "Not one dime more" for Trump's illegal Iran war. And the lawmakers aren't hiding inside. They're walking out through the bronze doors and standing shoulder to shoulder with the crowd, on camera, calling the Iran war exactly what legal scholars say it is.
That it has been used and cited by the Trump administration as justification for launching this war against Iran. He says that essentially the administration manufactured this idea of an imminent threat, and that is part of the reason why he's deciding to resign from his post today.
Let me read a little bit from this letter that he wrote to President Trump. This is Joseph Kent. He works for the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. But he writes this. He says, I cannot in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, and it is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. I support the values and the foreign policies that you campaigned on in 2016, 2020, 2024, which you enacted in your first term. Until June of 2025, you understood that the wars in the Middle East were a trap that robbed America of the precious lives of our patriots and depleted the wealth and prosperity of our nation. And he added this.
Illegal under American law and international norms. And while the chaos and the chanting consume the exterior of the building, the interior is experiencing its own form of quiet, devastating implosion. Inside those hallowed halls, the sounds are different. It is the sound of doors closing softly behind senior officials who have just cleaned out their desks. It is the sound of hushed conversations in the cloakroom about whether the president should step down. It is the sound of resignation letters being drafted, printed, and leaked.
In your first administration, you understood better than any modern president how to decisively apply military power without getting us drawn into never-ending wars. You demonstrated this by killing Qasem Soleimani and by defeating ISIS. He goes on and says more, Sabrina, but those are powerful words.
I think what's also important here is this is an appointee that was not someone that you could consider not aligned with the president. I mean, this is someone that espoused the MAGA-based views and was appointed by, of course, Tulsi Gabbard. And so the fact that he has issued a very public resignation and the fact that he's also said that Iran did not pose an imminent threat to the United States, a case that was made by Donald Trump multiple times and many other officials in this administration, including...
We are talking about people who were not planted in the administration by the opposition. These are Trump appointees. These are individuals who carried the MAGA banner, who were vetted for loyalty, who were placed in positions of immense trust and access to the nation's most sensitive secrets. And they are walking away. They are quitting in protest. And they are not going quietly into the good night of a corporate consulting gig.
The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, saying that Iran posed an immediate threat to the United States. And he's someone that clearly had access to intelligence matters, saying that they did not. I think you could potentially see other resignations from this administration, people deep within the MAGA base that do not support this war of choice. And frankly, it is a war of choice. It is something that the president chose to do. And he has said, you know, kind of on his own conscience, that he decided to initiate this war as well.
Yeah, he even said that he got Israel on on board.
Yes.
But in this letter, Joe Kent says he believes that this is started because of pressure from Israel and its American lobby. I'm wondering, General, what you think about one of the last lines here. He says, "You can reverse course and chart a new path for our nation, or you can allow us to slip further toward decline and chaos. You hold the cards." I'm wondering at this point,
They are going public, they are giving interviews, they are writing op-eds, they are telling the American people exactly what they saw from the inside. Capitol Hill is on fire. I am not speaking in metaphors about literal flames, but about a political conflagration of such intensity that it cannot be extinguished by a defiant press conference or a late-night social media rant. This is the kind of fire that melts the procedural armor that leadership uses to protect a president.
several weeks into this war, you have Iran saying that the Strait of Hormuz will never go back to the conditions where it was before. How do you chart a new course?
He needs to cut his losses, that being President Trump. He needs to cut his losses and shut this down as quick as he possibly can. That would be the best thing at this solution. You know, I'm not sure if he's got the capability, the wherewithal to actually do that politically. But I mean, this is not going well, and it's going to get worse. And bully for Mr. Joe Kent for having the political courage to stand up for what he believes. You know, this is a guy that's a big-time MAGA supporter, has always been, very much like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who you had on your show yesterday. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are significant resignations from the MAGA world, and people need to take note. And I hope that this leads to the resignation of other members of the administration, because he is absolutely spot on target. This is not in the best interest of the United States to continue this war, and President Trump needs to shut it down as quickly as he possibly can.
Let me read another sentence or two from his resignation letter. As a veteran who deployed to combat 11 times, and as a Gold Star husband who lost my beloved wife Shannon in a war manufactured by Israel, I cannot support sending the next generation off to fight and die in a war that serves no benefit to the American people nor justifies the cost of American lives.
It burns through the calculations of party loyalty because it is being fed by oxygen from every single direction at once. Outside, there is the roar of the protest movement. Inside, there is the whisper of resignations. In the courts, there are stinging legal defeats. In the Senate and the House, there are near-miss votes that reveal just how fragile the president's coalition has become. And now, on the campaign trail, in the living rooms of Iowa and the town halls of New Hampshire, the question of impeaching and removing Donald Trump over the Iran war is no longer a fringe demand.
Yeah.
I mean, we've already seen 13 American service members die in this war. Over 200 have been injured, and their conditions have ranged from very serious to some have been returned to duty. But I think, you know, we've heard Pete Hegseth say this time and again, that more Americans could lose their lives. And I think this letter makes it very clear, is that worth it? Is that worth the cost? And this is someone that's obviously gone to war on behalf of our country and seen the cost that it takes, not just on the people who are putting their lives on the line, but on the country. And so I think it is really important that not only is he putting this out today, but this is someone that is a deep figure within the MAGA base, and someone that is aligned with the president and is breaking very publicly with him.
And it's personal for him, as you noted, Wolf, that his wife was killed in Syria in 2019 by an ISIS bomber. You know, I just want to go back to you, General. Clearly, you don't agree with this war.
It has become a litmus test. It is the threshold question that voters are using to separate the serious candidates from the pretenders. When a political demand moves from a protest chant outside the Capitol to a primary litmus test inside the voting booth, it has crossed the Rubicon into the mainstream of American political life. That is precisely what has happened to the calls for Trump to resign or face removal over the unauthorized conflict in Iran. This journey did not start yesterday. It started with the lonely voice of Representative Al Green.
But at the same time, Israel is saying that it has taken out more top Iranian officials, including one who has been overseeing a lot of what Iran has been doing in its counterattacks. And I just wonder if you see any progress, any benefit so far from this war in terms of safety toward the United States because of some of the people who have been taken out.
First of all, I commend the military performance thus far in the war. I mean, it's been superb. And look, no one's shedding any tears for the Khomeini's demise and a new Ayatollah and the aggressive nature that they have had towards in the region and been a threat in the region. I mean, I'm all for for doing something about the Iranians, but we were not provoked.
Introducing an impeachment resolution that the leadership quickly killed by a margin of 344 to 79. It built momentum through those nail-biter bipartisan war powers votes that failed by just 7 votes in the House and 6 votes in the Senate. It gained intellectual heft from the overwhelming consensus of the legal community, and it was supercharged by the seismic 6-3 defeat at the Supreme Court that clipped the president's emergency powers.
And the problem here is that we're in the middle of a long war, at least a long war for them. I mean, I remember what Henry Kissinger said about Vietnam. He said that, the Americans will lose by not winning, and the Vietnamese will win by not losing. The Iranians just want to sustain themselves, stay in power as long as they possibly can, continue to harass the United States, like attacking Baghdad and the embassy there and whatnot, and stay alive long enough so that they can claim victory. And that's what they will do if they do this long enough.
Let's go actually to the White House, where we're going to find our Kevin Liptak, who's been tracking any responses coming from the administration. What's the latest, Kevin?
Yeah, nothing official yet from the president, although we're expecting to see him any moment now in the Oval Office with the Taoiseach of Ireland. He's here for St. Patrick's Day. But you do hear, officials who are within the Trump orbit beginning to sound off on this. One former White House official described Joe Kent as
It was fed by the rupture of alliances, the shocking closure of airspace by Spain, and the jaw-dropping $200 billion no-timeline funding request from the Pentagon. And it is all culminated in this moment, a moment where Democratic candidates are being sized up and judged based on a single clarifying question. Do you support impeachment and removal as the appropriate constitutional remedy for an illegal war? That is not the echo chamber of the progressive left talking to itself.
Egomaniac, someone who is resigning this position in quite a high-profile fashion. And I think that is probably along the lines of what we will hear from the president if and when he decides to respond to this. But I do think it will be difficult for him to entirely dismiss this resignation as someone, with Trump derangement syndrome, as someone who is a Trump enemy, as he does so often, just because Joe Kent has so often aligned himself with the president. He is of the MAGA wing of the party. That's how he ran as a candidate for Congress 2 times in Washington state, and it is why he was selected for this position in the first place. His confirmation was not an easy one by any means. He was, very narrowly confirmed by the Senate, and all of these questions about...
That is the sound of an accountability movement becoming the central organizing principle of an electoral coalition that is building toward a massive confrontation. And at the very center of this inferno stands Joe Kent. We covered the initial shockwave of Kent's resignation in the last video, but we need to revisit it because his departure is the keystone that holds the entire arch of this story together. Joe Kent was not a career bureaucrat who survived from the previous administration. He was Trump's own hand-picked national counterterrorism chief.
Conspiracies around the 2020 election about potential ties to white nationalists all arose in his confirmation hearings. And for all of those reasons, I think it will be difficult for the president to sort of entirely distance himself from this individual who is now coming out very publicly decrying some of the perceived rationale for the war in Iran. And I do think it will also put in a very difficult position Joe Kent's boss, the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who has espoused, in previous lives, the very same positions about questioning the adventurism of previous iterations of the Republican Party, questioning nation-building pursuits. She, too, was a veteran, just like Joe Kent, and so putting her, I think, in a difficult position. But certainly we expect to hear from the president very soon, and hopefully he will be asked about all of this.
We'll see what he says. All right, Kevin Liptak, thank you very, very much. I want to bring in CNN K-File senior editor Andrew Kaczynski, who's joining us on the phone. Andrew, I know you had previously reported that Joe Kent gave a previously unreported interview back in 2022 to Grayson Arnold, a Nazi sympathizer and white nationalist. A spokesperson for Kent, who was then running for Congress at the time, said, and I'm quoting him now, Joe Kent had no idea who that individual was when he encountered him on the street, and Joe Kent has repeatedly condemned the statements that the individual is accused of making, end quote. Andrew, what more can you tell us about Kent's past?
He was a decorated Special Forces veteran with the combat scars and the operational credibility to prove it. He was MAGA aligned through and through, having run for Congress with Trump's explicit endorsement. He was a true believer placed in one of the most sensitive national security positions in the entire federal government, and he resigned in protest.
Well, look, Joe Kent's resignation is dramatic, but it's really not particularly surprising if you look at his record. He's a former Green Beret. He did numerous tours overseas. His first wife, Shannon, was a military member who was killed overseas in a suicide bombing in Syria that targeted U.S. troops. What's remarkable here, too, is that he entered politics in 2021 to primary a Republican who had actually voted to impeach Trump. He had 2 failed bids for Congress. And when he entered politics, he specifically said it was in part because he witnessed, and this is a direct quote from one of his videos launching his campaign, the failures of the government establishment in keeping us at war in the Middle East, watching officials, as he said, quote, lie about regime change wars. And during that campaign, both campaigns, he railed against the military-industrial complex. He railed against endless wars.
He walked out, and then he opened his mouth. He said publicly and unequivocally that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States. He said the war was launched not because of a ticking time bomb intelligence assessment, but due to sustained pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. Kent's resignation is being described as the most senior to date over the Iran war. Let those 4 words sink in. Most senior to date. That phrasing confirms what we have long suspected. It implies there have been others.
In one of the interviews he gave, he literally said, let's not start a new war with Iran. That was a 2021 interview. At the same time, as you mentioned, he has been a polarizing figure during his congressional run. He did face repeated scrutiny over contacts with far-right figures and extremist figures, which he later disavowed. And of course, he works for Tulsi Gabbard, who before joining the administration had a long history of opposing war with Iran. And not that long ago, just 5-6 years ago, she was literally selling, as she ran for Congress, merchandise that said no war with Iran on her campaign website. So this also puts a lot of questions at her, as has been mentioned here. But ultimately, I do think that his resignation here reflects his longstanding opposition to American intervention abroad.
It signals that Kent is merely the highest peak of an iceberg of discontent and moral injury floating beneath the surface of the administration. There is a pattern of departures by officials who had access to the raw intelligence, who knew the actual threat picture, who understood the decision-making calculus in the Situation Room, and who concluded that what they were seeing did not justify what the president was doing. When insiders leave and they talk, they perform a function that no outside expert, no matter how credentialed, can ever fully replicate. They validate the external arguments with internal evidence. The protesters outside the Capitol can shout that the war is illegal, and they are absolutely correct. The constitutional law community is virtually unanimous on the point that launching a sustained bombing campaign without congressional authorization is a textbook violation of the separation of powers. The lawmakers joining the crowd can demand not one dime more. And they are absolutely correct that the power of the purse is Congress's most fundamental and non-delegable check on executive overreach. The legal scholars at the Brennan Center, the ACLU, Politico magazine, and the Georgetown International Affairs Journal can all write brilliant analyses explaining why this war is an impeachable abuse of office. And they are absolutely correct. But Joe Kent says something that none of them can say. Joe Kent says, I was there. I saw the intelligence. I sat in the meetings. And I am telling you that the imminent threat, the only legal fig leaf that could possibly justify an unauthorized war, simply did not exist. And the decision was made anyway, driven by political pressure from a foreign government and its domestic lobby. That is the inside account colliding head-on with the outside fire. And Capitol Hill is caught in the middle of that collision, surrounded by both. So let's map out exactly what is happening here, because this is not a single crisis. This is a three-front war being waged against the Trump administration simultaneously. And the convergence of these 3 fronts is what makes this moment uniquely dangerous for the president's political survival. We are going to examine the protest siege outside Congress. We are going to dissect the resignation crisis eating away at the administration from the inside. And we are going to trace the path of the impeachment argument as it moves from legal theory to electoral mandate. Then we will talk about what happens when all three of these forces converge at the exact same moment in time, and whether the resulting heat is finally enough to move the votes that have, up until now, stubbornly held in Trump's favor. Let's start on the streets with the protest front. The Not One Dime More campaign is not just a generic anti-war slogan. It is a surgically precise, constitutionally literate demand. Every single word in that phrase has been chosen to do a specific job. Not one dime more is a direct invocation of the power of the purse. It is a reference to Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, which states that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. The protesters are not just expressing moral outrage or strategic disagreement with the bombing campaign. They are issuing a direct command to the legislative branch. They are telling Congress, use your most potent weapon. Use the one power that the executive branch cannot ignore. Stop writing the checks. Throughout this entire saga, we have documented how Speaker Johnson and the Republican leadership have used every procedural trick in the book to protect the president from positive congressional action. They have canceled votes on war powers resolutions. They have used tabling motions to kill withdrawal mandates. They have manipulated the Rules Committee to keep impeachment articles buried in the graveyard. When Congress tries to do something, pass a law, invoke a statute, move an article, leadership has the tools to stop it. But the funding cutoff is different. It requires Congress to do nothing. The Pentagon has submitted a jaw-dropping request for a $200 billion supplemental funding package with no specified end date and no clear strategic objective. That request requires Congress to act affirmatively to appropriate the money. If enough members of Congress simply refuse, if the political environment becomes so toxic that the supplemental never even makes it to the floor for a vote, the war runs out of money. Not because Congress passed a law to stop it, but because Congress refused to fund it. The procedural obstacles that Johnson uses to block positive action are useless against the power of inaction. The protesters outside the Capitol understand this dynamic perfectly. They are not asking Congress to pass a new statute constraining the commander-in-chief. They are asking Congress to refuse to write the check that keeps the bombs falling, and the lawmakers who are walking out of the Capitol to stand with those protesters, standing in the cold, holding those signs, denouncing the conflict as a violation of U.S. and international law, are making a public record. They are positioning themselves to vote no on the supplemental when that moment of truth finally arrives. They are building the political accountability architecture for the funding fight that is coming down the pike. Now, let's step inside the building and examine the resignation front, because the exodus of talent and credibility is accelerating. Kent's departure as the most senior resignation to date is a signal flare that illuminates the deteriorating conditions inside the administration. Senior officials in any White House are constantly engaged in a grim calculus. They weigh the benefit of staying, the ability to influence decisions, to moderate extreme impulses, to slow down bad ideas through sheer bureaucratic friction, against the cost of staying, which is personal association with policies and actions they know to be wrong. The threshold for leaving is different for everyone, but it generally rises with seniority. A junior staffer can quit and barely make a ripple. A cabinet secretary or a national counterterrorism chief quitting is a seismic event. When senior officials start heading for the exits anyway, it means the internal calculus has shifted dramatically. It means they have concluded that staying no longer provides meaningful influence, and that the risk of being personally implicated in something indefensible is now too great to bear. Kent did not leave because he thought he could get a better job on cable news. He left because he concluded that remaining inside meant being permanently stained by a decision he believes was made on false pretenses for improper reasons. And the phrase "most senior to date" is the key that unlocks the larger story. It tells us that Kent is not an isolated case of a single disgruntled employee. He is the most prominent face in a pattern of departures. There have been others at lower levels, analysts, deputies, staffers, who saw the same intelligence, who sat in the same briefings, and who reached the same conclusion. Each departure is an individual's calculation that the cost of association now exceeds the benefit of influence. When those calculations start to cascade, when the most senior official yet decides the threshold has been crossed, it sends a powerful signal to everyone else who is still inside, sitting at their desks and wrestling with their conscience. Who else is running the same calculation right now? Who else is looking at their spouse and their kids and asking if this war is worth their reputation? The administration cannot answer that question publicly without drawing even more attention to the hemorrhaging. They cannot reassure the remaining staff that everything is fine without acknowledging that everything is fine is even a topic of discussion. The resignation creates a cloud of uncertainty inside the West Wing and the Pentagon at the exact moment when maximum external pressure is being applied from the streets. And then there is the third front, the one that changes the entire political landscape for the long term, the electoral litmus test. When impeach and remove Trump over the Iran war becomes a standard question in Democratic primary debates, it means the accountability demand has been institutionalized. It is no longer enough for a candidate to say the war is a mistake or that Trump overstepped his bounds. The primary electorate is now sorting candidates based on a binary yes or no question. Do you explicitly support impeachment and removal as the constitutional response? That question admits no hedging, no nuance, no strategic ambiguity. Candidates who answer yes are making a binding commitment. They are telling primary voters, if you send me to Congress, I will vote for articles of impeachment. I will vote for war powers resolutions. I will vote against that $200 billion supplemental. The primary process is, in effect, building an electoral mandate for the accountability agenda in every single district where Democrats are competitive. This matters enormously for the Republican members of Congress who are currently standing in the way. Remember the math. The war powers vote in the House failed by just 7 votes, 212 to 219. Those 7 Republican members who voted to protect Trump's unilateral war authority do not live in safe, deep red districts where they can ignore public opinion. They live in competitive purple districts. They are the ones who have to face the voters in a general election. And in those general elections, the Democratic challenger will not be running on a vague platform of being better. They will be running explicitly on the impeach and remove mandate that was forged in the primary. The Republican incumbent's voting record, 219 to 212, a vote to give Trump a blank check for war, will be the centerpiece of every attack ad, every mailer, and every debate question. The electoral pressure does not operate on the same timeline as Speaker Johnson's floor maneuvers. It takes months for primary results to shake out. It takes even longer for the general election to arrive. But the institutionalization of the accountability demand means that the political cost of protecting Trump's war authority is not a one-time fine. It is a debt that compounds with interest every single month that the war drags on without resolution and without congressional authorization. Now, here is the most important part of this entire analysis. What happens when all 3 of these fronts converge at the exact same moment? The protest front alone generates political heat, but it is a heat that a disciplined leadership team can usually manage. They can dismiss the protesters as partisan activists. They can frame the movement as a fringe element. They can use the procedural levers of the House to cancel votes and avoid putting members on the record. Johnson has managed the protest front effectively enough that it hasn't yet flipped those 7 House votes. The resignation front alone generates bad news cycles and credibility damage, but it can be contained through the standard playbook. You attack the character of the departing official. You claim they misunderstood the intelligence or weren't in the room for the final decisions. You paint them as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Kent, if he were the only problem, could potentially be managed with those tools. The electoral litmus test front alone generates medium-term pressure, but it feels distant to a member of Congress who is up for re-election 2 years from now. They can calculate that the environment might shift, that something else might dominate the news, that they have time to adjust their position. But when all 3 are operating at once, the dynamic changes entirely. The crowds outside the Capitol validate the electoral litmus test. When a primary candidate says, "I support impeachment," they can point out the window at the thousands of people surrounding the building and say, "Look, that is the demand of the people. I am listening to them." The Kent resignation validates the protest crowds. When the protesters chant that the war was built on lies, they now have the former counterterrorism chief, a MAGA loyalist with a security clearance, backing them up. He is saying the same thing they are saying, but from the inside. That is an unassailable validation, and the electoral litmus test validates the resignations. Kent's departure becomes vastly more significant when the demand he is supporting is being encoded into the DNA of the Democratic primary process. He is no longer just a lone whistleblower. He is the spark that helped ignite a movement that is now reshaping the electoral battlefield. Each front reinforces the others. The credibility of each argument multiplies because the other arguments exist. And they all converge on a single specific target. The 7 House members and the handful of Senate Republicans whose change of heart would flip the constitutional math that has, so far, insulated Trump from every single accountability mechanism we have discussed. Those members are watching the crowds outside the building where they work. They are reading Joe Kent's resignation statement and the follow-up interviews. They are watching Democratic primary candidates in districts just like theirs run explicitly on impeach and remove. They are running the calculations in their heads. They are asking their district directors and their pollsters, has the environment in my specific district finally moved past the tipping point? Is the cost of protecting the president's war now greater than the cost of defying the speaker? Speaker Johnson can cancel a floor vote. He can whip a recorded roll call. He can manage the procedural space inside the House chamber. But he cannot cancel the crowds on the street. He cannot silence a decorated Special Forces veteran who has already spoken. He cannot insulate his members from the primary dynamics that are building back home. He can control the machinery inside the building, but he cannot control the political fire that is raging outside it. And that fire is now burning from every direction. The protesters are at the gates, demanding that the funding be cut off. The most senior resignation yet is on the record, stating that the entire war was built on a false premise. The electoral process is institutionalizing the demand for removal as a test of fitness for office. Trump is caught in the middle, a man who has always relied on bluster and loyalty to survive, now facing a convergence of forces that his usual tricks cannot deflect. He can attack the media, he can attack the judges, he can attack the Democrats, but how does he attack a decorated Green Beret, who he himself appointed? How does he attack a crowd of Americans who are simply demanding that Congress follow the Constitution? How does he attack a primary process that is happening in hundreds of districts across the country? The building is not literally burning. The dome still stands. The marble is intact, but the politics inside those walls are ablaze. The pressure is reaching a boiling point. The calls for resignation are growing louder, moving from the fringes of the activist left to the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and even into the quiet, fearful conversations of Republicans who know what their constituents are seeing on the news. We are watching a presidency being consumed by a war it chose to start. And the question that Capitol Hill is now asking itself, quietly at first, but with increasing urgency, is a simple one. How much longer can this building withstand the heat before the walls start to crumble? We will be right here, tracking every protest, every resignation letter, and every shift in the political winds.